From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. To my faithful listeners in the province of Alberta, I think fondly of the years I spent at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Honeybee Lab working under Dr. Steve Purnell. There were many things I loved about that job, and one thing that comes to mind is this room on the second floor of the main building that was stuffed full of bee journals. Going all the way back to the 19th century, it was a real delight to spend any amount of time in that room. And it was in that room that I discovered the Holy Grail: how to get queen bees through the winter in a bank. Now, for those of you who aren't beekeepers, maybe this is lost on you, but queens are abundant late in the year. It's easy to make them and breed them and mate them, but it's hard to get them in the first thing in the spring. And so what this paper from 1969 by Harp described was getting these queens into one colony and banking them all the way through the winter. Now, subsequently, there have been some pioneers in this work. There was also the thesis in that room was the thesis of Marguerite Dogtrum, a dear friend of mine who recently passed, who also kind of rediscovered this work and tried to get it going here in the Pacific Northwest. And subsequently, past guests like Heather Higo and Shelley Hoover have been working on this, as well as the University of Guelph and University of Laval. But there really hasn't been a kind of taking up of this work here in the Pacific Northwest until now. I'm really excited this week to welcome back Ellen Topitzhofer from the OSU Sagili Lab. She's been actually cracking this nut recently, and she's got a research project on how to bank queens. She also has a brand new publication on how to ship queen cells that has been funded by Project Apis M. So some real practical tips in this episode. But before we get started with the episode, I want to remind you, March 5th is coming up. That's the day that is the annual bee event. This year it's going to be virtual. It's the biggest conference dedicated to pollinators in the Pacific Northwest. It's going to be featuring Olivia Messenger Carroll from the Bees in Your Backyard. Also, she's been working on a Western native bee field guide. So always exciting hearing from Olivia. Get your tickets now. I'm going to have the link in the show notes. Again, that's Saturday, March 5th, and anybody around the country can attend this year because it's virtual, and I bet you next year it's going to be back in Albany. So last chance to attend B-Vent. And without further ado, here we go. This episode with Ellen Topitzhofer talking about banking queens over winter.
We should have recorded this in the bee yard because they're like in person, but I guess it's still a little cold in Western Oregon. We had that nice, beautiful weekend, and now it's cool again.
Yes. Yep.
But you've come back from almond pollination, and I think one of the things that you were mentioning is that I think many people are hearing about this. It's just been a very fast bloom in California this year.
Yes, it's been what people describe as a flash bloom. There are many parts of California, the almonds are in full bloom right now. I'm even starting to see some petal fall in the northern part. Also, what's kind of interesting about this year is that there are some significant delays of queen orders from Hawaii. And so that is something that also, so you have this really early bloom, not necessarily early, but I mean, it's going to be over sooner than I think what a lot of beekeepers anticipated. Mm-hmm. And at least for some beekeepers, they don't have their Hawaiian sourced queens when they need them. Mm-hmm. They're about 2-3 weeks delayed, which can make a pretty big difference for beekeepers with their March management in almonds.
Okay, so before I want to get on, we're going to be talking almost exclusively about queens. I want to pick up on these Hawaiian queens in a second. But is a flash bloom good for beekeepers? Is it good for the crop? Is it bad for the crop? Is it bad for the beekeepers? How does these intense blooms, how does it play out in terms of how everybody ends up at the end of the day?
That's a good question. I think from a grower's perspective, I'm not exactly sure if it's a bad thing. I know all the cultivars are blooming in very quick succession, which I think the growers have to have a different management approach for something like that. For beekeepers, it can be tough because you have this huge rush of almond or pollen collection that happens, and sometimes that's difficult to manage. And so in a flash bloom situation, you can you may not have enough time
Yeah, I imagine the best thing would be your colonies have come out of winter, they go to California, and they get a little pollen, they grow a little, they get a little pollen, they grow a little, and now it's just like they got as much pollen as that small little colony or the colony could gather, and then they're out of pollen. Like that, I imagine it can be tough on them. They don't quite get moving.
Right. So with like the growth, the general growth curve, if you have your, instead of having, like maybe a 3 or 4 week window of where this growth curve could go, you may only have, 10 days, 2 weeks in the case of a flash bloom.
The kids, people who are of my generation remember Sim Ant. It was this little video game where you would take your ants and like some resources would appear and your ant nest would grow when the resources fell, like somebody's hot dog lands on the plot of grass. But I imagine that's the thing, is like you need sustained growth to get a honeybee colony up and ready and ready to get going.
And with almond pollination, that actually brings up a good point. For most bee colonies, especially in like the northern part of the U.S., you have to have your colonies ready to be rented in almonds in January. That is arguably pretty unseasonably large. You need really large colonies when, for naturally those colonies would still be in winter mode, right? So yeah, I think that having large colonies, and by that I mean an average of 8 frames of bees typically is what you need to be to have a rentable unit. Minimum of 4 frames of bees as colony strength. That's, beekeepers put a lot of inputs into their, supplemental feed, protein supplement, sugar syrup, to get those colonies ready to grow in January. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But as you mentioned, this is a very early crop for a lot of people. For everybody, this is the first crop that they're going to pollinate. And so one of the things that comes up is you come out of winter and you find a colony's queenless, or you've got like queen problems. And you mentioned that Hawaii, which produces the earliest queens for the U.S. market that I am aware of, doesn't really have queens quite ready in January. Like you just mentioned with this flash bloom, Hawaiian queens may not even match up with like the colony growth. And so just paint that picture. Why do people need extremely early queens? Did I get it right? Is it kind of like plugging up holes? And
so beekeepers often, they'll have a handful of colonies that are queenless, or they'll have queens that just aren't they aren't healthy enough to have a colony grow in a way that a beekeeper needs that colony to grow during almonds. And so there's this pretty high demand for queens in January and February for those purposes. And beekeepers, they can't buy queens outside of the U.S. And so as far as queen supply, the earliest available queens come out of Hawaii. And the first round of queen sales from Hawaii usually happen the last week of February and into March. It varies from year to year. Shortly after that, you'll get queen cells, and then California sourced mated queens. The queen cells would also come out of California or southern states.
When does that generally happen?
That happens in March.
Okay.
So you have, your queen supply, although limited, starts as early as late February and then March. The bulk, of those very first queens happen in March. So you have, January, February. If you don't have queens of your own within your operation to supply your demand, you're out of luck.
Now we've got a great publication, OSU, your colleague Carolyn Brees and Ramesh Sagili and Harry Vanderpool are on it, of making nukes. You have these smaller colonies that you can plug in They already got a queen in them. I guess that's one option, but that's a lot of equipment. A nuke is you got to tie 4 frames up, and you have to feed it a lot of syrup and.
Exactly. Yeah. So the concept of so looking at that technique and also looking at the technique that we're going to talk about today, which is overwintering queen banks. The concept is you have queens, mated queens that you either purchase or produce yourself in the fall. You overwinter them some way so that you can have them available in January. So the extension publication that we have is looking at overwintering queens in individual 5-frame nukes, nucleus colonies. You can also do that same thing with even tinier mating nucleus colonies. Mm-hmm. And then you can also do them with banks. And the main advantage to overwintering queens in a bank colony is that you can, for one single bank colony unit, you can overwinter many caged queens. So when it comes to like the amount of resources that you put into, say, a bank colony, it's going to be a lot less than overwintering 5-frame queens in 5-frame nucleus colonies. So for example, you can overwinter 30 queens in a bank instead of overwintering, making up 30 nukes to overwinter those same 30 queens.
That's a lot more worker bee to queen ratios, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we're talking about a bank, probably some of our listeners aren't even honeybee people. There's like, I'm a gardener, and it's like, banks? What do they mean by banks? So let's just go back to sort of the bank that everybody's familiar with. Middle of summer, you get a shipment of queens. You don't have a place for them all, and so what do? It's a regular summer. How do you make a regular summer queen bank? Describe what we're looking at. It's a regular colony, is it?
Yeah, it is. You can. You don't have to make it a full-sized colony to make a bank in the during the field season.
You've had nukes that you've done them in.
Yeah,
so
we've done
smaller 5-frame boxes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Or a single is easier to manage if you're doing it long term. But basically, what you do is before those queens arrive, you can do it the day before. You can do it the day of. You go into a colony that is healthy. It's low on varroa It's got enough food. It's got enough bees. Enough to keep the amount of queens that you're going to put into that bank warm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you need enough bees.
Yeah, you need to select a colony that's going to be big and clean, basically free of mites and brood disease.
Okay, a big clean colony. What else makes this a good? I guess you don't want another queen in there.
Exactly.
Well, it's got to be queenless.
Yeah, there is. I know some beekeepers that have tried to do a queen right bank with very marginal success. Currently, I definitely recommend that you remove the mated queen that's laying eggs in that colony. Mm-hmm. You can do it a day before. If I do it the day before, it just saves me time on shipping day when those queens arrive. I'll put some temp queen, synthetic queen pheromone, inside that bank colony to kind of hold them over.
Hold the bees, yeah. Mm-hmm. So the bees will all kind of disperse. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and then about 15 minutes before I put those queens in, I'll take out that synthetic queen pheromone. Or if I'm making it up on the spot, I'll wait about 15 minutes so that they know that they are now queenless. Mm-hmm. And then you have a banking frame that holds all of your caged queens. That could be, I've seen a whole different array of designs of banking frames.
The ones we got were made by the great Harry Vanderpool, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he has a great design. It's very thin, easy to produce, cheap to produce. You actually, as far as I know, you can't buy banking frames from a manufacturer. You have to make them yourself. So his are made with welding rods and wood. It looks similar to an actual frame that you would put in.
If you look down from the top, it looks like a frame, and then you pull it out, and it's like it doesn't have the comb, but it has an open space where you put the caged queens, like they're in the same cages that you get them in bulk, and so they're just kind of lined up side by side like a little gallery.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the key is you want to make sure that they don't fall over on the banking frame or out of the banking frame. You want to make sure that you don't have any kind of, I guess, opportunity for either the queens or the workers to chew through a cork. You want your, you want any kind of cork to be flush with, the
because a queen that's out will just go around sting every queen in the cages.
You don't want a queen to get out.
Yeah, okay.
That would result in all of the other queens or the majority of the queens to die, which is, catastrophic when you're making a bank. So generally following that, making sure, the other thing that you want to do with your banking frame is you want to make sure that the mesh screen of your queen cages are accessible to the workers.
Facing out, because some of these have a back. And I guess the thing is that it's not just they're keeping them warm, but they're feeding them.
Exactly. The two main functionality of a bank is that it's an incubator. It keeps those queens warm, and the worker bees in that bank feed those colonies or those queens. You could, in theory, do this yourself as a human. There's an old paper on it. I think these researchers were able to keep these queens alive in an incubator set to 95, but they had to constantly feed them. And so anyway, that's just a little tidbit.
I guess that's the other option for people. And we'll get into wintering again, but when you get queens and you've got them for 3-4 days, you can keep them on your counter and just give them a little water every day.
And like maybe a little bit of honey as well. You could do that. The other thing you could do is you could keep them in the shipping box. I mean, in a way.
I forget I'm Canadian, so I always think there's attendants in the cages. I guess you Americans don't have. It's just a queen.
I think you would be able to keep even queens in 3-holder cages with the 7 worker attendants in there. I think you could keep those alive for 3-4 days as well.
I've done that all the time.
Yeah, and you could also, with the way that we usually get our shipments, it's not the queens are by themselves inside their cages, and their California mini cages with scoopfuls of loose shipping attendants. You could, in theory, keep those alive for a while too.
Put in a battery box, attendant bees. Okay. Have I ever told you my horrifying undergraduate research story?
No.
So I was doing this thing with queen. It was I don't know. I can't even remember. It's like my undergraduate thesis. And I had got 40 JZBZ cages in those little JZBZ plastic shipping things, and I was working. I worked till it got dark, and I left the bees the queens without attendants on the dashboard. I didn't bring them in.
Oh no.
And I got them in the morning, and they looked dead. And I was like, oh no, I killed all the queens. And so I turned the truck on, the heater came on, or driving back, and then they all came to life again. I was like,
they were just cold.
Yeah, I never told Mark Winston that. He'd probably revoke my PhD and send me back to grad school. But anyway.
Well, and now we know the effects of colder temperatures on queens.
I'm not telling you what research paper that is.
Okay.
That's all in the past. What stays in undergrad? What happens in undergrad stays in undergrad. Okay. Anyway, so I guess that one last thing about just summer queen banks. I suppose you make them up fresh the way you described, but sometimes you want to keep a queen. How long can you keep these going, like a queen bank, and how do you keep them going?
Yeah. So
extended period of time.
So I will hear some beekeepers say, If I put queens in a bank, I want to get them out of that bank as fast as possible, because, and I can kind of see how beekeepers would think that queens somehow don't do well in a bank, but I'm a firm believer that that's not true. You can bank queens long term, and what we're finding out with this project too is that their quality isn't damaged by long-term banking either when they're actually introduced into colonies eventually. But at OSU, we'll have a bank or multiple banks going on starting in April and May and all the way through until October, a full field season, a really long time. We do that we requeen everything every year. We do that for research purposes, but we keep the old queens, and so that's why we do this long-term banking, and we'll use those queens throughout the season. We always end up finding a use for them. And the way that we keep that bank, well-maintained, big, and big is, the main part, is that we do have to actively maintain that colony so that they're, in that queen bank, there's no laying queen. So we have to consistently supply that bank colony with young queens.
Because otherwise the bees just get older and older and older and grumpier.
Yeah. Yes. And if you don't have younger bees, worker bees present, you do risk the queens not being well attended as well.
That's right, because they're the ones that, their glands expand. They're the ones that provide. So they're the ones that.
They're the ones that feed the queens.
Feed the queens well. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are two ways you can really do it. You can put brood frames in from donor colonies into your bank colonies, either once a week, once every 2 weeks. If you do decide to put brood frames in there, you have to return back to the colony to cut queen cells that the banked colony could potentially make. Those workers could potentially draw out queen cells.
Oh, right, because there are queens in there, but the full signal complement, the brood, it is not all there, so they may start making a queen cell.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's a pheromone imbalance where there's like a really low amount of brood pheromone, a really high amount of queen pheromone. I'm not actually sure why they are stimulated to draw queen cells out.
That was actually my undergraduate thesis project.
Oh, with
yeah, but let's not talk about it right now. I'm kind of squeamish about it. But I guess the thing is that they can rear a queen, and then that queen pops out, and unbeknownst to you, she goes through and systematically stings all the queens in the bank, and that's why you got to go back in. So you give it a frame of brood, gives a flush of nice young bees, but then you go back just 3-4 days later, and you can then see if the queen cell's starting to form and just knock them all off.
Well, I recommend waiting a little bit longer than 3 days because sometimes it's hard to...
Oh, they're just like a little nub.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll go back in, take the brood frames out, shake the bees off of it, look for those queen cells to then remove and put that back in. I do that between 7 to 9 days after you put that brood into the bank colony.
Okay.
So that's key, is to make sure you go back and cut those cells.
So how frequently are you kind of like giving them a flush of new bees?
I'm doing it once every 2 weeks.
Okay.
Other beekeepers I've talked to recommend doing it once a week. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's take a quick break at this point, and then let's transition to your research onto doing this banking long term, but through the winter.
Okay.
All right, let's take a quick
Sounds
break.
Good.
It's just like the old silent movies. We have a little clapper to.
Is that just to signal? Is that actually doing something with the app that you have on there?
No, it's just like in the old movies. It's like, it's like you get
ready, action.
Take 4. I gotta get one of these. Listeners, if any of you have one of those old movie clickers, please send them to us. Actually, I'm gonna get one after the show's over. Okay, but back to this. So we're talking about these banks in the summer. Super useful. You can order a bunch of queens in, and then, I'm going through some colonies, something's wrong. I'm just gonna walk over to the bank, pull a queen out, put it in, and you just keep working. You got this nice little store without having to call somebody up. I need 3 queens today. You got like 20 and then 17. Okay, so that's, everybody knows this. It's a great thing. You gotta get your special cage made up, and it sounds like a piece of cake. Now we're coming around to this problem that we were talking about in almonds. It's January. Nobody has queens, and these queen banks were not, at least traditionally, meant to go through winter. this is where your research comes in. So tell us about the challenges. I know people have tried this in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of work that's already been done before we decided to look into it in Oregon, mostly in Canada.
Yay!
Yay! When they have longer winters. But the main difference about a bank colony that goes through the winter is that you are not constantly putting younger bees in there.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not putting brood frames in or bulk bees into that. You're not regularly maintaining that bank like you would in the field season.
So the bees just get older and older and older with time.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they are. They have a different physiology. They are winter bees, and so they can live that long.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot more preparation to making that bank so that they can all survive through the winter. You don't have as much flexibility in boosting that colony's, population, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, you have to make sure they have enough food, and they do have to be like really, really big. But at, a field season nuke,
okay, so
or a field season bank, you can run it in a single or in a 5-frame nuke, but you
really,
can't
really
do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so tell us how you start. So when are we starting our winter bank? When's the months that you're starting doing this?
Yeah, so one of the goals of my project is to make sure that I can come up with a system of selecting a colony or multiple colonies in a general, commercial beekeeping operation, so that they can do it as quickly as possible in the fall. But again, there's a lot of preparation that you have to do to select these colonies. So I start about a month before those queens are ready to go into the bank.
Okay, a month before, and this is when? What month before?
So I like to put, you could start your bank in September, but I like to start my bank for the winter in October.
So you're starting the preparations in September then?
I am.
And what are you doing?
So what I've been doing for the last 2 years, and it's worked out really well, is I'm working with a commercial beekeeper. He will send me to 2 or 3 of his super productive yards. Mm-hmm. I go through those colonies. I see which ones are the biggest ones. Mm-hmm. I tag all of the colonies that have at least 12 frames or more. Mm-hmm. Those are pretty big colonies.
12
for
frames
September.
Covered with bees.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. The supers are off at this point. Mm-hmm. Also, for those who are not familiar with general Western Oregon management, these colonies have also undergone several rounds of miticide application. Mm-hmm. So, they may not be completely done with their mite management regimen, but they are well on their way to being, they've been treated for a while with specifically for varroa mites.
Okay.
So all the ones
that was one of the things you talked about with the summer ones. You want nice, clean, big, clean bees. So we've selected them. We've gone through. You've found the big, strong colonies. They're free of mites and parasites. So that's the first part. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's even more important for an overwintered queen bank, because you want to make sure that those bees aren't compromised with viruses going into the winter,
sure, right.
Because that can really reduce the number of frames of bees over time in the winter.
Gotcha. Okay.
So 12 frames of bees or higher. Mm-hmm. From those tagged colonies, I'll take a mite sample. So I take a field, your standard cup of 300 bees, worker bees that I sample from the brood nest, do an alcohol wash, and then from there, I select colonies. In theory, I want the banked colony to have 0 mites in that sample.
Okay.
I have, though, on several occasions, have also accepted colonies with 0.3 or 0.6 mites per 100 bees. So in that sample of 300 bees, you find 2 mites or less.
Okay.
Those colonies still qualify, as a potential bank colony.
Okay.
So very, very low mite levels we're talking mid to late September. Those are very low mite levels for that time of the year.
Okay. So you've found your 3-4 colonies now, let's say.
Yeah. Yes. And so then from there, I select my queen bank, or in my case, for my research, it's multiple queen banks, 10 or 15 banks. And from there, I make sure that I put enough honey stores on there. So the banking frame is going to be so kind of backtracking, getting to the basics. A banked colony that goes over the winter, it's going to be 2 stories, 2 boxes.
Yeah.
The banking frame will be in the dead center of the top box.
Gotcha.
That top box is going to be full of honey frames besides the banking frame. I have found that for Western Oregon, putting about 60 pounds of honey works well. So that's 6 full frames of honey that are deep frames. Mm-hmm. So I will, more often than not, the colonies don't have that much honey in them. Mm-hmm. So I will find either frames of honey from other colonies, or I'll take some stored honey and put that in there. The key, though, that I want to emphasize is that one of the big tough things about the fall is robbing. So sometimes, robbing can be really difficult and to work with, especially when you're moving honey frames around.
Oh, I imagine, yeah.
Yeah, so what I do is I make sure that I do this. I time my selection of the banks and the order of the queens that come in with this Oregon beekeeper that I'm working with, so that I can move those honey frames around while they're still in their production yards. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty common for then colonies to be moved out of their production yards into a wintering yard location. Makes it easier for them. They consolidate a bunch of colonies into one spot. Makes them easier to move them down to almonds, stuff like that. So I make sure I move the honey frames around before they're moved to their wintering yard location. And then so I do that. They end up moving to their wintered yard, and that's when I put the queens in.
Okay.
Because robbing can get really crazy when you're moving honey frames around. It can also be really tough when you're installing those queens into your banking frames and then putting them into your banked colonies. You want to really minimize the amount of time you have a colony open, or you have your queens out in the open in that wintered yard. Yeah,
because when robbing happens, the bees are all aggressive and everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so these queens, clearly they've been banked themselves. Like, they must have been bred in August or something. They must have been the last supply that came out that you produced for the year, right? Okay, so these queens have been banked already in a kind of regular bank for a month or so. And now you're transferring them in, and that frame, do you pack honey into that frame, the actual banking frame? Is there space around it that you want them to draw comb and kind of like fill up the spaces with honey and comb?
That's a good question. I do a couple of things that I don't know if it really helps or not. And one of those things is putting the queens around the edges of the banking frame are more susceptible to being chilled.
Oh yeah, because it's
on the
edge,
very, very outer edges. So what I recommend is that instead of putting queens there, instead I'll put like some cut comb and put it inside that empty space with the banking frames. Does it really help? I don't know. I am assuming it adds some kind of insulative factor there, that wax. So so that's what I do. I have tried to have them draw out that wax themselves, but it doesn't really work very well. So I just have cut pieces of comb that I'll just stick in there.
Okay, so you're in October. You've got these colonies that don't have very many mites. You've moved some honey around to make sure that they've got a good store up front. You've taken your colonies, your queens, they're kind of filling up this banking frame. They have a little bit, you don't go right to the edges, just as the cluster contracts, they're just not going to abandon anybody. How many queens are you putting into these things?
Well, so...
And what kind of cages?
The cages are California mini cages. You can use other cages too.
But you can pack them in.
You can pack them in. I will put corks in, so not candy pluck. They come with corks. I'll push those in so that they're flush with the queen cage, and I'll make sure that those cork side are down on the banking frame, so
nobody
they're not
can choose
exposed.
through them. Nothing falls.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah. And the first year we looked at just having 20 queens in the banks. This last winter of 2021 to 2022, we looked at overwintering 30 queens. So we have a banking frame that has 3 rows. So we did 3 rows of 10 in like the centermost portion of that banking frame. We also looked at just 60 queens all the way through edge to edge. And the banks of 30 queens did remarkably well. Besides one bank, and I want to get back to the one bank, we had, I think, an average of 93% survival with 30 queens going through the winter. And it was about, it was mid-October to, it would have been mid-January when I took that survival count, that first survival count. So
those last 2 queens singing Diana Ross, I did survive.
Well, there was one bank that had 30 queens that, and this happened in the first year too with one bank. There was this huge amount of queen loss. Like half of the queens died in the first 9 days.
There was no bees in the colony? What happened?
No, there was and I'm so frustrated because I don't have an exact answer for what happened with this last year. But the first year, there was a queen running around in that bank.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
So it happened to have been a colony that just had 2 queens in there because I physically removed one queen. And none of the queens got out of their cages in the banking frame. And so that's what happened the first year. But I do not have, I hunted around for a queen roaming around in there and I couldn't find her. So I don't have an exact answer. So I think moving forward, that's just something that beekeepers are going to have to expect using this technique, is you might end up, having some kind of issue where you do end up losing a fair number of queens in that very first 1 to 2 weeks. Sometimes you can explain it, and sometimes you might not. I might not have, there might have been a hatched out virgin or something of a cell that I didn't find. Or, it could be a number of reasons why that happened. So I think it's probably to be expected that you might have like some kind of variance there, or an outlier, I should say.
But this 30 queen bank seems to be the most reliable. And I guess going all the way back to the beginning of the interview, the people like, if you bank a queen for more than a few days, it's going to go downhill. Tell us a little bit about how you're answering that question. So what happens with these queens in January?
Yeah, well, and just to conclude, the ones with 60 queens each.
Oh yeah.
Before we move on real quick, they did okay, but they did. I think the average was 70% survival with the queens with 60 queens each, and there was notably more queen death on the edges.
Okay,
not surprising.
As you thought.
But,
okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So January comes around. You're going through your colonies, getting ready for California. What did you do in the experiment?
So as soon as they were moved to California, we also didn't find. We found no to very little queen death by transporting them from Oregon to California for the almonds.
Oh, that's handy.
Yeah.
So you can put it down in a central location, and you can start to work out of it like a regular
Exactly.
bank. Oh,
yeah.
good.
The theory behind it is you'd have a bank in California, and you use the queens as you please.
Okay.
And so from there, like when I was in California, this was the last week in January, I then started to put brood in those colonies. Alternatively, you can put bulk bees, like a package of bees in there that are really young bees. You can't really do that early in January, but that's something you could do if you're maintaining a field season bank later on. But yeah, I started putting 2 frames of brood in those colonies, and I'd do that once every 2 weeks.
All right, but you evaluated whether these queens were any good, right? So
yes.
How did you? So to answer this question, can a queen bee bank for this long and not suffer damage? you have an experiment that you do when you get to California. Tell us about that experiment.
Yes. Yeah. So right. Besides evaluating just general survivability, the other big question we have is what are the effects on a queen with this long-term banking? And so in the last week of January, for the last couple of years, I've sampled queens out of the banks and sent them to the North Carolina Queen Clinic. North Carolina's State University Queen Clinic. So they dissected those queens for me. They looked at weight, thorax width, the kind of morphometric measurements. They also looked at their total sperm count, and what is the most interesting one for this particular question is the amount of sperm are still viable. And we have found that there are no differences in between banks that have 30 queens and 60 queens each. There was, the year before, we had a series of controlled queens that were sampled from just regular colonies. And we found that in one instance, in one of our replicates, the banked queens they weighed less. They were smaller than the control. We also found that there was a lower sperm viability particularly in the banks that went into indoor storage. That was one of our replicates of the first year of the study.
The potato sheds up in Idaho.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and so that was also, those banks had a pretty low survivability as well. So it's possible that you can have lower sperm viability in a banked colony, and it's likely because some of those queens are chilled on the edges.
Okay.
And so it's really important that we maintain really, really big colonies. And also having them in, the variable of having them in indoor sheds might be something that happened the way that they were stacked, or it's unclear exactly what caused such a variable survivability rate in those in the indoor storage. So we're continuing to look at that, and we want 3 years of data to see exactly how, I guess, the risk of having a lower percent sperm viability with queens and banks. The other thing that we're looking at is we're installing those banked queens in colonies, and so I'm maintaining these banks now in almonds until March, and we're installing those banked queens into new splits that are made up, and we are comparing those queens, their brood pattern, the colony strength, whether that queen lives, how long that queen lives. We're comparing that group of banked queens with Hawaiian sourced queens, which we consider that the control, because those are the queens that those are the only queens available. Yeah.
And this is the first year you're doing this?
So I just looked at, this is was like the 11-month mark I looked at. So we have 1 year's worth of data from that, and we have found that
so 11 months after making the splits?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so we made them up in March of 2021. I just looked at them in late January. And I had looked at them throughout the year last year. There was a fair number of colonies that either replaced their queens somehow. And actually the biggest drop happened between June and August. But it was the same case for the Hawaiian sourced queens. There were no differences in queen retention. And there are no differences in brood patterns or frames of bees as well. And so for at least the first year, the banked queens performed at the same capacity as the Hawaiian sourced queens.
All right, so just the last question here is, so this work, as well as another project that we'll have to get you back to talk about, the Queen Cell project, these have both been supported by Project APISM?
Yes, the banked project, our primary research funds are from Western SARE.
Right.
But Project Topitzhofer is working with us to produce a guide on how to do this, on how to make up queen banks, both for just the regular field season and for overwintering them.
Because there's already lots of people talking. You've got a great guide out with Project Topitzhofer on shipping queen cells.
Yeah.
So this can be sort of a companion publication, just giving people, what we talked about in the podcast in much more detail on how to do this.
Yes. Yeah. So right. Yep. Project Topitzhofer has a technical guide on our other project on shipping queen cells, also on indoor storage, which I wasn't directly involved with, but yeah. So we're going to have a technical guide out on queen banking. We are hoping to have it published later in the year, this year in 2022, and so it's exciting.
That's great. Well, I'm looking forward to this. This sounds like a great solution to a problem that I'm sure many people face, and it's really great to see such practical research getting done. So thank you so much. We will be in touch, and I'm looking forward to maybe sneaking a few queens out of your queen bank this summer.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sin Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.